one corner of my grandma's living room stood a lamp that was almost never turned off. She would change the bulb every week like clockwork, waiting until the afternoon sunlight poured through the windows and filled up the room. But even then, she would hurry, holding her breath until the deed was done and the lamp was back on. I would ask her about it once in a while, and each time she would smile softly, tussle my hair, and promptly change the subject. I didn't learn the truth until I was 13. First time I turned off the lamp. I just wanted to see what would happen. My grandmother screamed when she walked into the darkened room, a plate of cookies falling from her hands and crashing to the floor. I could hear her praying under her breath as she raced to turn the light back on. Tears were shining in her eyes when she turned to me, her lips pressed thin. And without warning, she slapped me hard across the face. Grandma had never so much as raised her voice before, and I was too shocked to cry. She cried enough for the both of us, gathering me up in her arms and begging for my forgiveness. With her face buried in my shoulder, she finally told me about the lamp. "It's a ghost light," she said. Ever since she and my grandpa had bought the house, back when they first arrived in America, the spirits of the dead had plagued her. Only when her burden threatened to drive her mad did she ask Grandpa for help. She'd expected him to laugh her out of the house, but he had surprised her by nodding gravely. It was he who had first lit the ghost light. As long as the beacon burned through the darkness, she would never see another spirit. I stopped visiting my grandma after that. It started gradually at first, missing a day here and there, but by the time I received news of her death, I hadn't seen her in over 10 years. As her only living relative, I shouldn't have been surprised when I inherited the house. Yet, as I sat in her lawyer's office, listening to him read her will, I was speechless. I had a difficult time paying attention after that, absorbed as I was with the business of remembering. So much love had filled those walls, so many happy memories. As I thought of my tiny, sterile apartment in the city, I quickly made my decision. I was almost overwhelmed by my emotion as I walked through the front door. Everything looked exactly as I remembered it from childhood. Houseplants still cluttered the windowsills, decorative bird plates still hung on the walls, and the ghost light still burned in the living room. Seeing the old lamp sent chills down my spine, and I froze in my tracks, the smile fading from my lips. And I couldn't help but think of that night Grandma had slapped me so many years ago. I'd told my mother about the ghost light the next day, but she'd dismissed it as simple old-world superstition. It was the same way when she was growing up, she told me, and I shouldn't worry about it. Still, I couldn't shake the conviction that I'd finally seen the true depths of my grandma's lunacy. I ran my fingers through the fringe of a lampshade as I thought, a bloom of sadness darkening my nostalgia. Sighing heavily, I turned the ghost lamp off with a decisive click. Something woke me late that night. I lay in my bed listening to the darkness until I heard scratching coming from the living room. Rats were the last thing I wanted to deal with at the moment, and I rolled over with a groan, determined to ignore it until the morning. The scratching continued intermittently, constantly jerking me from the edge of sleep, and I'd finally had enough. And I threw the blankets off me and stormed out into the hall. Moonlight flooded the front of the house, and I didn't bother turning on lights as I made my way to the living room. I knew every inch of this house, even after so many years, and I moved confidently through the dim light. I was furious at having been woken from a dead sleep, and my anger ill prepared me for what I found. An elderly woman was crouched in the corner, her gaunt back to me. She was scratching at the floor where the walls met, stopping every few minutes to cock her head. A gnarl of dread unfurled in the pit of my stomach. I had no idea who this woman was or how she'd gotten into my house. All I knew was she obviously needed help. It took me some time to summon the courage to approach her. My hands shook as I reached out to gently squeeze her shoulder. I meant to ask her where she lived, who her caretaker was, but the words were driven from my mind when she turned, and I saw her face. Her eyes were solid black, bottomless pits that didn't reflect the moonlight. Her jaw hung impossibly open, unhinged, and the dark tunnel of her mouth spiraled down into her throat. I had a moment to realize who she was, to recognize that familiar map of wrinkles in her face, the curls of her wispy hair. Then, my grandmother screamed. I shrieked, stumbling backwards from the nightmare in the corner, my arms flailing in the air. I reached for the nearest lamp, and my hands touched the ghost light. I yanked the chain, filling the room with light, and she was gone. I never turned off the ghost light after that. After letting the bulb burn out one evening, I began changing it every week, just as Grandma did. Eventually, I got married, and luckily for me, my wife was tolerant of my strange fixation on the lamp. The light continued to burn, and I lived my life happy enough. But my grandson has been asking about the ghost light lately. Each time he asks me, I smile softly, I tussle his hair, and promptly change the subject. For some reason, I can't bring myself to tell him the truth. I think about how I pulled away from my grandma, how I thought her crazy, and I keep my mouth shut. I worry though. I know I won't be around forever, just as I know he will eventually turn off the ghost light. I worry that he might see me then, twisted, wrong, and scratching in the corner.